Transition questions. If you're studying for the SAT, you've probably seen them. I'm talking about those questions that ask you to provide the most logical transitional word or phrase to connect two sentences, or two parts of the same sentence. They make up about half the questions on the expression of ideas domain, which in turn represents about 20% of the questions on the reading and writing section of the current digital version of the SAT. So if you're hoping to earn a top score, you're going to need to be able to solve them well. But if you struggle with them, never fear, because in this video, I'm going to give you 4 simple steps that you can use to solve them quickly, confidently, and best of all, correctly. So the steps you should use when approaching transitions questions are this. 1. Read the part before the blank. 2. Read the part after the blank. 3. Establish the relationship between the parts before and after the blank. 4. Find the answer choice that best expresses that relationship. That may sound too simplistic to possibly work, but I've been teaching the SAT for over 15 years, and I've seen countless students earn scores in the high 1500s or above using this method. That said, it can take a little bit of practice to get used to applying these steps, so let's begin with an easy example. And after that, we'll move on to the harder stuff. This one is rated a 1 out of 3 in terms of difficulty by the College Board, the company that makes the SAT. Let's begin with step 1 and read the part before the blank. It has long been thought that humans first crossed a land bridge into the Americas approximately 13,000 years ago. Now, let's hold that in our thoughts as we complete step 2 and read the part after the blank. Based on radiocarbon dating of samples uncovered in Mexico, a research team recently suggested that humans may have arrived more than 30,000 years ago, much earlier than previously thought. Now it's time for step 3, establishing the relationship between the parts before and after. In this case, the part before is presenting an old theory about when humans first reached the Americas, and the part after is presenting new evidence that goes against that theory, suggesting a very different date. Therefore, it seems like the relationship between the parts is contrast, which means we'll want a contrast transition. And moving on to step 4, I'm going to look for an answer choice that expresses that relationship. And answer C, however, is a contrast transition, which means it gives me exactly what I'm looking for. Not bad, right? Granted, that was a fairly easy question, so let's try again with one that's a little bit harder. This one is rated a 2 out of 3 in terms of difficulty. Let's begin by reading the part before the blank. Award-winning travel writer Linda W. McFerrin considers the background research she conducts on destinations featured in her travel books to be its own reward. Now let's read the part after. McFerrin admits to finding the research phase of her work just as fascinating and engaging as exploring a location in person. So what's the relationship? The first part is telling us that this person finds conducting background research on travel destinations rewarding. And the second part is telling us that she finds conducting that background research just as fascinating and engaging as actually going to those places. So it seems like the second part is emphasizing or supporting the first part, and we're going to want a transition that accomplishes that goal. And looking at our answer choices, I see a perfect fit. D, in fact.
Mr. Greenberg! Mr. Greenberg!
Hello there, student me.
But can't be likewise also be used to introduce related information?
Well, it depends on what you mean by related information. The transition likewise is used to introduce an idea that is similar to the one just expressed, but still new. It can't be used to simply emphasize or support the idea that has just been expressed. So it wouldn't be appropriate in this context. But that brings up an important point. If you want to do well on the SAT, you're going to need to be comfortable with all of the transitions you're likely to encounter on the test. I've gone through all the official practice questions, as well as unreleased bootleg versions of past exams, and I've compiled a list of transitions that have come up in the answer choices. If you want to see that list, you can download it for free at my website, ivyleaguementorsprep.com. I'll leave a link in the description. Now back to the video. We've just tackled an easy question and a medium question, so I think we're ready to move on to the harder stuff. The rest of the questions you're going to see in this video have all been rated a 3 out of 3 in terms of difficulty, which means they're as hard as it gets. If you're up for a challenge, try hitting that pause button as soon as each question is displayed to give yourself a chance to work through it by yourself before we discuss it. You ready? We'll begin with the part before. The study found that the greater the iconicity of a sign, the more likely it was to have been learned. Now the part after. The correlation between the acquisition and iconicity was lower than that between the acquisition and another factor studied, sign frequency. So what's the relationship here? The first part is telling us about one finding, which is that there's a positive correlation between a sign's iconicity and how easily it's learned, acquisition. But the second part is telling us that this correlation is not as strong as another correlation, the correlation between sign frequency and acquisition. So I'm guessing we're going to need some kind of contrast transition. Now looking at the answer choices, here's where a lot of students may run into trouble because we don't see any of the usual contrast transitions, like however or nevertheless. That said, I do see another transition that can be used to indicate certain types of contrast. I'm talking about C. Granted is used to indicate a special kind of contrast, concession. That's when the author is acknowledging information that goes against or weakens the main point of the text. And that seems to be what's going on here. So the answer must be C. Let's move on to the next question. Now glancing at this question, you may notice that something is a little different here. In all of the questions we've tackled so far, the blank has come at the beginning of a sentence, but here it comes in the middle. A lot of students get thrown off or confused when they see questions like this, but they're actually no different than the more common ones with the blank at the beginning. And to explain why, here's a brief note on grammar. The transitional words and phrases that you'll see on the digital SAT are all going to be conjunctive adverbs. Don't worry, you don't need to remember that term, but it's important to realize because the placement of conjunctive adverbs within a sentence is a bit flexible. The blank could come at the beginning of the sentence, somewhere in the middle, or at the end of the sentence, but the meaning is going to be the same no matter what. The transitional word or phrase that we put in the blank is still going to be giving us the relationship between the previous sentence and the sentence that it's in. Therefore, when reading the sentence with the blank in it, it's best to just ignore the blank, to pretend it's not even there. Let's try that right now. Tulip mania, the rapid rise and sudden fall of the price of tulip bulbs in 17th century Amsterdam, is often cited as an example of the perils of rampant market speculation. However, recent research has demonstrated that the episode was neither as frenzied nor as disastrous as has been thought. And then, the popular myth surrounding it should be regarded with some skepticism. So what's the relationship here? Well, the part before is telling us that based on recent research, the popular view of tulip mania may be wrong, that it actually wasn't as frenzied or disastrous. And the second part is telling us that the popular myth should be regarded with skepticism. So the relationship is really cause and effect. We should regard the popular myth with skepticism because recent research suggests that it may be wrong. And the answer that gives us that relationship is D, therefore. Let's move on to another question. As usual, we'll begin by reading. Plato believed material objects to be crude representations of unseen ideal forms. In his view, such abstract, non-material forms are the ultimate source of knowledge. Aristotle disagreed, positing that knowledge is best obtained through direct engagement with the material world. And then, sensory experience of the material is the ultimate source of knowledge. Now what's the relationship here? Well, the part before the semicolon is giving us Aristotle's view that knowledge is best obtained through direct engagement with the material world. And the part after is telling us that sensory experience of the material, which sounds a lot like direct engagement with the material world, is the ultimate source of knowledge. So they're basically the same thing. That means the answer to our question is going to be C, in other words. Let's move on to the next question. We'll begin by reading. With its cliched imagery of suburban lawns and power lines, John Ashbery's 2004 poem, Ignorance of the Law is No Excuse, may seem barren terrain for critical analysis. And then, cultural critic Lauren Berlant finds fertile ground in just its first 2 stanzas, devoting most of a book chapter to deciphering the weight of default space Ashbery creates in this poem. So what's the relationship here? Well, the first part is telling us that this poem may seem barren terrain for critical analysis. And the second part is telling us that a particular critic finds it fertile ground. Now, the term barren means empty or devoid of life, and the term fertile means kind of the opposite of that. Granted, they're both being used somewhat metaphorically in this sentence, because we're not actually talking about things growing or not. So if we're calling a poem barren terrain for critical analysis, we mean there isn't a lot of potential for critical analysis. And if we're calling it fertile ground, we mean that this critic sees a lot of potential. But they're still opposites, which means that the correct answer is B, nonetheless. Let's move on to the next question. As usual, I'll start by reading. Iraqi artist, I'm not even going to try, celebrated as the first Arabic poet to write in free verse, didn't reject traditional forms entirely. Her poem Elegy for a Woman of No Importance consists of 2 10-line stanzas and a standard number of syllables. And then, even in this superficially traditional work, was breaking new ground by memorializing an anonymous woman rather than a famous man. So what's the relationship here? Well, the first part is emphasizing aspects of a poet's work that were traditional or standard. And the second part is telling us that the poet's work was actually breaking new ground. So it really wasn't that traditional. That means the correct answer must be B, though.
Mr. Greenberg!
What is it, student
But
B?
isn't that grammatically awkward? Isn't though usually used like, though I hate the SAT, I have to do well on it? I'm not big on grammar terms, but this usage seems kind of different.
You bring up an interesting point. Though can indeed be used the way that you just used it, as a subordinating conjunction if you want to get technical. But it can also be used this way as a conjunctive adverb. In this case, it's basically equivalent to however. But since you've brought up the topic of grammar, there's something even more important that you should know. When it comes to transition questions, grammar doesn't matter. The College Board has released almost 100 official transitions questions so far, and for all of them, and I know this because I've checked, all 4 answer choices will be grammatically equivalent. So while there may be plenty of questions on the digital SAT that do require you to consider grammar, with transition questions you only need to think about meaning. So let's move on to the next question. As usual, we'll begin by reading. When one looks at the dark, craggy vistas in Hitoshi Fugo's evocative photo series, one's mind might wander off to the cratered surfaces of faraway planets. And then, it's the series title, Flying Frying Pan, that brings one back to Earth, reminding the viewer that each photo is actually a close-up of a familiar household object, a frying pan. So what's the relationship here? To be honest, this may be the hardest question that we've seen so far, and I think that's because it's hard to see the relationship just by looking at the sentences. The first sentence is telling us how a photo series may remind people of faraway planets, and the second is telling us that the title reminds viewers that the photos are actually just of a familiar frying pan. It sort of seems like contrast, so a lot of students will pick B, alternatively. But that isn't a great fit because alternatively implies that there are 2 options, or alternatives. And it's not like the photo series brings to mind faraway planets or is actually of a familiar object. It's both, even though they're quite different. So if you're struggling to determine the relationship, one trick you might try is process of elimination. As we've established, the answer can't be B, alternatively. So what about A, consequently? Clearly not, because the fact that the photos evoke faraway places is not the reason they're actually of familiar objects. So what about C, ultimately? Now this one makes a lot more sense. The transition ultimately is often used to introduce deeper truths. So the photos look like they're of distant planets, but deep down, in truth, they're just of a frying pan. It seems we found our answer. C, ultimately. Now I'd like to solve one last question, but before we do, a quick public service announcement. I recently created an Instagram page where I will be posting regular free practice questions for the digital SAT. I also have a ton of free resources available on my website, Ivy League Mentors Prep. I'll be sure to leave links for both in the description. Now back to the video. As usual, let's begin by reading. In a heated debate in biogeography, the field is divided between dispersalists and vicariancists. And then, there are those who argue that dispersal is the most crucial determining factor in a species' distribution, and those who insist that vicariance, separation due to geographic barriers, is. So what's the relationship here? The first part is telling us how biogeography is divided into these two fields. And the part after seems to be telling us the same thing, but in simpler words. So I'm looking for a transition like, in other words. And D, that is, means exactly that. So there you have it. We've just solved a bunch of the hardest transition questions on the digital SAT, but when we follow these 4 simple steps, I think they're not that bad. What do you think? Feel free to leave a comment below. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks as always for watching, and good luck on the test.